Our wonderful panel tonight. We have Dr. Sepe Verheyen, who is Chief of Staff at the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy, who is going to be moderating the conversation between our two champions. We have Dr. Shashi Tharoor, a best-selling author and Indian politician and former Under-Secretary General at the United Nations. His Excellency Omar Saif Gabash, author, Assistant Minister of Culture and Public Diplomacy, and newly appointed Ambassador to the Vatican. The topic of tonight's conversation is global transformation and the future of soft power. Now, going on in the ADNEC, I don't know if anyone noticed it, but there is a global Muay Thai conference fight going on, Muay Thai. So if we can't resolve it here, chaps, maybe we need to go there. All the best. Give these wonderful speakers a big round of applause.
Thank you, Isabel. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you are enjoying the Abu Dhabi International Book Fair. I did for sure. And you're in today for a real treat with such two speakers, two politicians, two diplomats, intellectuals, authors. So I'm sure you will enjoy the session. Now, today we're going to talk about global transformation and the future of soft power. Now, to set a tone, I would see that in the last years and decades, we really see a bit of transformation, meaning that with America's first policy of Donald Trump, we saw that certain alliances that were usual in the past were not so usual anymore. We saw, of course, with the pandemic, which put a lot of pressure on countries where unilateral decisions were made, where countries had to rethink how they will do their foreign policy. Then we had, of course, in Afghanistan, the turmoil that actually led to Taliban taking over. And of course, last but not least, we have the Ukraine crisis that showcased that the UN and as well other countries couldn't avoid this topic. And with these two gentlemen today, I'm going to try to explore these things more in detail. Let me start with you, Ambassador Gabash. Like when we were looking at the World Economic Forum, the main theme there was that history is at a turning point. So my question for you is, do you actually agree? Is history as a turning point? And what is actually still the future of multilateralism? What's the future of countries still working together?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I can hardly hear myself. Maybe we should turn up the volume so that the entire...
Yeah, let's turn up the volume. That's a good idea.
The entire book fair can hear us.
That's right.
Interesting that you mentioned the World Economic Forum, Davos, I'm assuming. It's a forum that I've never attended because I don't see it as part of multilateralism. I see it as an elite that is focused on a particular set of interests that other countries or countries may not share. And in terms of turning point, it seems to be a turning point every single day, every time you read the newspapers or go on social media. So. Certainly in the region we are experiencing a lot of change and a lot of it is being taken advantage of in a positive way. And I think here is where actually, if I can just touch on the soft power, many of the things that we've done individually as separate emirates has now begun to coalesce into a very, very good story. And it's not always that we are telling the story, it's what people looking at us are telling themselves. And the Ukraine-Russia war is another situation where, even though we're looking at a human catastrophe and a huge threat to global peace and security, the Emirates is actually benefiting directly through a brain drain from both the Ukraine and from Russia into the Emirates. So I think we do have a soft power play. We may not be entirely in control of that soft power play, but we certainly benefit from it.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Tharoor, you started as your role as Under-Secretary General at the start of this decade. So my first question for you would then actually be, how do you see if you compare the international cooperation now with international cooperation when you started, do you see that it became better? Did it flourish? Or did it get worse, actually?
Well, I think it's under grave threat now, because I spent 29 years at the United Nations singing the virtues of multilateralism. But I'm afraid that in the last decade or so, I've become a good deal less optimistic. And I think more than Ukraine, though I think Omar is right to say what he said, I think more than Ukraine, what really shook the world's acceptance of and faith in multilateralism was the pandemic. Because when the pandemic happened, you suddenly had people realizing that they needed their own governments to keep them safe. Everybody was, governments were scrambling to first get PPE, protective equipment for themselves. Then they were scrambling to get other kinds of goods, medicines, ingredients to make medicines. When vaccines were invented, they were trying to corner the market on vaccines for their own people. It's quite astonishing to see how all talk of international cooperation ground to a halt. You had people, governments openly talking about moving production lines closer to home because they realized that suddenly they were dependent on other countries for vital things that their people needed now, and they didn't want to wait for 5 other countries to get their act together. When the Chinese early on had lockdown 2020, I remember the horror in America as they realized that their favorite headache remedy, ibuprofen, came 100% from China. And they said, what do we do? We've got to find a way of making it closer to home or at home, that sort of thing. The European Union, I don't know if there are any Europeans in the audience, but they tend to be a bit complacent about how they're the global poster child for regional cooperation. The Schengen visa, for example. Well, the first victim of the pandemic was the Schengen visa. The Schengen countries threw up barriers between each other. One of the first European countries to have a bad experience with the pandemic was Italy. What do the rest of the Europeans do? Do they rally around in the spirit of multilateral regional cooperation? No, sir. They imposed export controls on Italy. They imposed barriers on people coming out of Italy. I mean, this is what happened in Europe. And the truth is that I think, while obviously all of this is eased up now, we often show our real selves when things are really bad. And when things were at their worst in the pandemic, multilateralism was the first casualty, whether at the regional level or the global level. As you know, President Trump announced America pulling out of WHO. There wasn't any of the kind of cooperation that the UN system was designed to ensure. We had this wonderfully ambitious WHO scheme to distribute vaccines everywhere. The principle is right that, until everyone is safe, no one is safe from a pandemic like this. And yet you ask me how many people in Africa have had 2 vaccinations in the 2 years since the pandemic broke out. Whereas, of course, in the UAE, you're all fine. I must say in India, we haven't done too badly. In the developed West, they're fine. But where is global cooperation? I really worry. And I think that the Ukraine thing has also now undermined our faith in our common humanity. So we're looking at a period in human history when multilateralism has never looked more vulnerable, in my view, since 1945.
Can I ask a question here? Some of the things that you said kind of definitely rang a bell. But how is it possible to remain non-cynical in the face of all of these very, very powerful forces coming out of the West, multilateralism, globalization, human rights, rule of law, and so on? And then the minute circumstances change, they are the first countries to pull back on all of those. I mean, if you look at what's happening in the UK today, Prime Minister changing the code of conduct in order to allow himself to continue to stay in power. Or, for example, when it comes to rule of law, due process, property rights, stuff that we've really respected in the West, overnight a certain category of person has been denied all of that. How are we meant to sort of sit and take the criticism from outside in the name of globalization, multilateralism, and universalism, and then watch this?
Well, even globalization itself, because what did you see was that the very countries that had preached the virtues of free trade, open markets, easy movement of capital, people, and so on, when the 2008-9 financial crisis hit them, and they had to suddenly pull back because there was a backlash in their countries, they abandoned what had been their received wisdom that they were preaching to the rest of us for 3 decades before that. So I will say that you're quite right. A certain amount of cynicism is inevitable. And what has happened, I think, in the last 10, 15 years tops, certainly since the rise of Trump in America, British Brexit, the rise of far-right movements in Europe. Not all of them were successful, but those who were not successful have come perilously close, like the number 2, the National Front, and so on in France, or in Austria, or in the Netherlands. They may not have won power, but they've come this close to winning power. So you have to ask yourself, what do we do? I mean, are the ideals still worth holding up and still worth articulating and still worth defending and fighting for? Because ideals are always worthwhile, but have no illusions that everyone is living up to the ideals. Above all, the ones who are preaching are the ones who are often the most willing to abandon them when it doesn't suit them.
Okay. Ambassador Gobash, to follow up on actually what was now discussed, I'm from Belgium myself, so a relative smaller country. So how can smaller countries stay relevant in the international community? What's your advice for countries like us?
I have no specific advice for Belgium. I mean, I wish you all the luck in the world. Obviously, we have to tread carefully. It's not so straightforward, sort of choosing our partners and our friends. And there is this very, very powerful narrative about countries being free and sovereign and independent and able to choose whoever they want. But then, when push comes to shove, clearly there are dominant, there are dominant partners and sort of subordinate partners. We just need to read. How do you say it? Read the coffee cup, the tea leaves. We know what side we're on, and our best strategy is to figure out how to accommodate ourselves to that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay. Ambassador Gobash already touched on soft power, and as we can see you a bit as the godfather of soft power in India, and especially in your book, Pax Indica, you actually explain the soft power of India. So could you tell us a bit more, what are the challenges for a soft power nation?
The real
as India?
godfather of soft power, as you know, is Joseph Nye, but I knew him reasonably well at one time in America, and I asked him, would you be comfortable if I applied your theory to India? And I sent him my paper on it, 20 odd years ago. And he seemed to like it. And at least he wrote to me saying he did. And so I proceeded then to speak on that and to publish it and expatiate the argument. And I'm pleased to say it's now become part of the conventional wisdom in India that soft power is one of our biggest assets. And that's largely because for the longest time, India was a country which was struggling with various challenges, including poverty and underdevelopment, inefficiencies of various sorts, corruption. You name all the classic developing country ills, we had it. But we were tackling them through an amazing capacity to incorporate differences, to manage diversity, to celebrate difference, and so on, in ways that others find quite attractive, and plus many aspects of Indian culture. Sort of almost despite ourselves flourished. Indian movies, Bollywood, Indian fashion, yoga. I mean, there isn't a small town in America where you can't get a yoga class, and all of these things, and Indian cuisine, of course. So all of these things suddenly made India an attractive commodity, irrespective of any specific issues with the economy or whatever else. I mean, Indian restaurants I mentioned, I discovered in Britain, for example, that Indian restaurants in Britain employ more people than the shipbuilding, coal mining, and iron and steel industries combined. So the empire can strike back, And now in these circumstances, you're looking at an asset for India, undoubtedly, which I believe we have done very little officially to create. It was just the natural products of our culture, of India being itself. And soft power is not something that governments can very easily manufacture. Because when governments try to manufacture cultural attraction, it becomes propaganda. And most people can see propaganda for what it is. Plus, your actual hard power policies undermine your soft power. So the Russians can send the Bolshoi ballet anywhere, but now it's the invasion of Ukraine that's going to be the prism through which people see Russia. When the Chinese were cracking down on Tiananmen Square, however many kung fu movies you liked, that wasn't going to be the principal image. So hard power has a tremendous capacity to undermine your soft power attempts, anything you try and do consciously. Hard power is exercised. Soft power is evoked. It's what people associate with your country when they just hear your country's name, for example. And that's where I think, till fairly recently, India scored very well because, I happened to be a UN official traveling in the Gulf countries when we had the results of our 2004 elections. And every minister, every senior official I met was just going absolutely incredulous about the fact that here in this country, not that far away from the Gulf, you have a country where the election had been won by a woman political leader of Italian descent and Roman Catholic faith who had just made way for a Sikh to be sworn in as prime minister by a Muslim president in a country 80% Hindu. And I said, we're not doing this to impress anybody. This is just the way India is. And it really won a lot of admiration. Now, is India still like that? Obviously, there are some serious questions that are being asked. Developments in our domestic environment at home have changed things a little bit for the worse. But I do believe that soft power is not something that you can escape one way or the other. I mean, you can either gain from it or you can undermine it through just what you do at home. Soft power is essentially about having a good story to tell about yourself. And if you are the land of the better story, you will have soft power. And if you are a land where everyone is telling terrible stories about you, however hard you try, you won't have any.
Thank you. Ambassador Gobaj, the UAE was quite well in telling their story in recent years. As we could see in the Global Soft Power Index, the UAE is now number 15 worldwide. So I was wondering, what is UAE's secret there? And as well, like in your capacity of heading the Office of Public and Cultural Diplomacy, how does public and cultural diplomacy helps with UAE soft power?
Well, I'm going to disagree with Shashi
Great.
and tell you that, in fact, my office is responsible for getting us so high up on the list of soft power.
Public diplomacy, of
Public
course.
diplomacy, absolutely. And I'm not going to tell you my secret of how we do it. I'm kidding, of course. It's very, very difficult to figure out whether a government or even an institution can actually push soft power. I'm actually thinking that I do agree that it's a kind of an expression of culture. And it's almost accidental. So the way in which I look at the Emirates, I mean, Dubai is obviously the key player within the soft power kind of constellation of the Emirates. And I don't know if they did it on purpose, but I'm assuming they sort of fell into it by accident. Emirates Airlines is just such a superb airline. They focused on the product, and that product then spoke for the country as a whole. And then, of course, you started getting copycats, both Etihad and Qatar and sort of other airlines. It's also straightforward. I think there's something about the character in Dubai that allows for people to connect with it on a very kind of visceral level. Other places that try to tell a story are a little too sophisticated, a little too particular, and it doesn't quite gel. So I think we take advantage of the spirit of Dubai to then allow that to kind of cover the entire Emirates. And I'm probably not going to get promoted for this, but I do think that we have to be honest with ourselves and sort of see what is it that really makes the success of the Emirates come out.
Thank you. Dr. Dahour, can a country just survive on soft power?
No. I mean, let's face it. I think Hillary Clinton had come up with that clever expression, smart power, which is essentially a combination of both hard and soft. If you have hard power without soft power, you're basically just a bully, and people don't like bullies. But if you have soft power without any hard power, you're essentially confessing your weakness, right? You need somehow to have just the right amount of hard power to back up your soft power. America has a lot of soft power. I mean, they're the land of Coca-Cola, Levi's jeans, McDonald's, Disney, all of these things, Hollywood, everything that the products of a culture that the rest of the world find attractive. The old joke about all the protesters outside American embassies during the Vietnam War and so on, screaming, "Yankee, go home, but take me with you." And this was the thing about America. But because they had the hard power, they had the clout to actually exercise their influence around the world in ways that, frankly, people had to take seriously as well. I can't really think easily of a country of any size that relies solely on soft power. Who could you think of, Omar? Not easy, right? I mean, every country has to also have a certain credibility emerging from hard power. Now, I'm not saying that soft power alone in any case is going to work, because, I mean, it's quite astonishing that these hijackers, suicide bombers of 9/11, their last meal was at a McDonald's. So you can point to a McDonald's and say, what a great example of soft power, didn't save the World Trade Center, right? Or indeed, we had a similar situation. There were some terrorists. The last thing they did before attacking a marketplace in India a few years ago was watch a Bollywood movie, which is again supposed to be our soft power at work. So I don't want to exaggerate that soft power is a panacea for anything. I think you've got to have both, and you've got to somehow strike a reasonable balance. If you are too heavy-handed with your hard power, you will lose friends. You need the soft power to attract. I mean, the whole logic of Nye's theory was that if you actually can attract people to you, you can economize on the sticks and carrots that hard power requires. And that is a reasonable thing, but you still need the sticks and carrots. You know, Theodore Roosevelt's famous line, speak softly and carry a big stick and you will go far. So speaking softly is your soft power, but that big stick you still need, otherwise people are not going to listen to you when you speak softly.
So I sometimes wonder, hard power, does it refer only to military power?
And economic might.
And economic, exactly. So I was thinking of Switzerland, I was thinking also of the Emirates. We have soft power, but we also have a certain amount of hard power, which is essentially petrodollars, and also a financial system that allows people to deploy those, their own money. So,
right.
now, yeah, so people would say that might be soft power and that might be hard power. But also having a clear sense of identity and a backbone, so that you don't just get pushed around by larger states. I think that also, if you can pull it off and you can be consistent about your principles, then you'll find that other larger powers will take you into account and maybe provide a bit more respect.
Right.
And I think that's an issue for smaller countries, actually, to be taken seriously.
So we're both on the same page there, but say a country like Switzerland did get taken serious, and their neutrality was respected by everybody, even by the Nazis during World War II. So it was striking, right? I mean, when you think of Switzerland, there's that famous line in an Orson Welles movie about what did they invent, just the cuckoo clock or something. The truth is that, yes, you do think of the cuckoo clock and chocolates and cows on the hillside and scenic beauty, but you also think banking secrecy, which is part of their hard power. You think economic might. The Swiss franc is almost as strong as the euro. You think you think neutrality. And these are all elements that go to making Switzerland a force to be reckoned with, so even though it didn't belong to any of the regional blocs. It only relatively recently joined the UN. It's been an interesting example, actually, of a country that exercised a sort of quite hard power and a lot of soft power while staying quite independent and aloof from everyone else.
And in the last few months, it's actually given up on a lot of that. It's actually...
I mean, somebody was remarking on the number of Ukraine flags you can see flying in Switzerland today.
But I mean, their claim to fame has now moved to places like Delaware, Dakota, Wyoming, all the secrecy, right, around bank accounts, and they've been forced to open up. So in a way, they've given in to the pressure from greater powers to give up on their soft power.
Well, but that's not the only aspect of their soft power, right? So the chocolates and the cheese still count, and that isn't being given up.
Or maybe Iceland, because they also don't have an army. So that could be an example as well.
I think Belgium hasn't made enough of Tintin.
That's true. That's one of our best export products, actually.
Absolutely.
So you're right. Right. Now we're talking here as well about soft power, because with the new technologies, you can actually have an easier access to soft power. You have an easier access to showcase what your country is doing. So, Dr. Tharoor, you are the chairman of the Standing Committee on Communication and IT in India. So, my question here is, like, how do you see this evolving? How do you see politicians and diplomats using the technology that's out there in their benefit?
Well, actually, it's happening a lot. When I first opened a Twitter account, I was the only minister in the government of India, and what is more, government computers could not be used to access Twitter. Social media was blocked on government computers. We've come a long way. Under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, for example, who is from the different party from mine, but he not only has a huge following on social media, but he requires all his ministers to open accounts if they don't have them. Says, get your messages out on social media. So there's very much the sense that social media as an instrument of politicians is essential. But before I took this over, I was a minister in our foreign ministry, and I was also chairman later in opposition of the External Affairs Committee. And this business that you and I were briefly talking about before, of what you might call digital diplomacy, actually works. I mean, so when I remember that on an official visit to the UAE, a minister jokingly referring to me as Minister Twitter. It was still a curiosity, because no minister in the UAE was on Twitter. Now they all are, by the way. And what's interesting was that I remember going, and the then Bahrain foreign minister was persuaded to open his first Twitter account because he saw the impact that I could have. Okay, what did you were able to get information about your diplomatic efforts out directly to the public without worrying about whether the media got your story right, whether the media found it interesting enough to publish, whether the media reported it or followed you at all. So the social media suddenly gave you an opportunity to bypass regular media and also become a multiplier of regular media. So it actually has been quite useful now. And since then, a lot of people, I mean, it's very striking, for example, when you see some of the world leaders today, they go somewhere, there's somebody putting out a tweet within 5 minutes of them making a speech. That shows that getting your message across through social media has become an indispensable element in the armory of public diplomacy.
So, Ambassador Ghobash, does every UAE diplomat has a social media account then?
Yes, unfortunately, and we try to control that.
Yeah, I tried to find Omar Ghobash on Twitter, and he doesn't exist.
No, I do. I promise I do.
I searched. So what's your handle?
Oh gosh, Omar Saif Ghobash.
Ah, well, that explains
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Okay, I'll find it next time.
And
Tonight's, if somebody give all these people taking photos of somebody will give me one, we'll
somebody
tweet
help
them.
the man. What was the question?
So
Are we all on
there's
Twitter? I think there's a difference. India is a very vibrant democracy, and you have an sort of government, you have an opposition, you've got this appeal to constituents, and you want to continually sort of engage directly with them. We are a leadership-driven country. Most of the time, what we're doing on social media is really sort of signaling to leadership, we're at work, we're doing our job. These are the different things that we've sort of done today, and so it's a very different tone. We don't necessarily express ourselves in the same way as they do in India.
And are both of your countries looking into virtual embassies, as for example Barbados opened their first embassy in the metaverse?
Yeah.
Who did that?
Barbados, sorry.
Really?
Yeah.
Barbados has a virtual embassy in the metaverse. That is interesting. I must find out more about that.
Yeah, the Barbados ambassador has a big, he's got a technical background in blockchain, and he's very much, he's a technologist, so he's done an amazing job. We were hopefully going to, sort of engage with him in the metaverse, but it's taking a bit of time.
Don't you see any downside to this?
Downside?
I mean, the metaverse is not the real world, right? I mean, you've got these characters who are interacting, but they're not really real people, or are they?
I'd say that actually they provide a good competition for the world that we see out here. The real world is what we put in front of our eyes and allow into our ears.
Fascinating. That would be a totally new challenge for diplomacy if we had. But you see, in the metaverse, you can go to war with each other and not really do any harm, whereas in the real world, you can't. So that's. I would imagine the stakes are higher in diplomacy in the real world.
I had a fascinating discussion with my older son, who is at university in the US, and they cancelled a lecture one day because the lecturer had been assaulted online in the metaverse. And this had caused massive emotional damage, and therefore they couldn't continue the course for a few days until they had recovered. So there was an opening there.
He must have had a very good virtual reality headset,
right?
and therefore felt the assault as if it had really happened. I'm afraid there's even been cases of rape and so on in the metaverse. Yeah, but I mean, the real person and the real body hasn't actually been assaulted or raped. It's you have the feelings as if that's happening to you is what the issue is.
Well, and at some stage, the law is going to have to take that into account. Yeah? I mean, if somebody is
It's all
actually
emotional
emotionally,
damage.
yeah. I mean, an assault is really a threat to hurt, right? You can, if I show you a gun and point a gun at you, even if it's a fake gun, if you think it's a real gun, in the UK, that would be an assault.
Yep. Well, we're going to have to grapple with all of this, folks. I don't think we're sitting here offering answers because I don't think the answers have been figured out here? I mean, this is a
I think
completely
Sepe
new
has the answers.
evolving view.
I think
Yeah,
the
you have the
Belgian,
answer, Sevi?
I don't think so. I'm just a moderator, so I don't have answers here. Ambassador Ghobash, you just mentioned your family, and actually leads up to my next question. You wrote a very fascinating book, Letters to a Young Muslim, where you actually address your son about how to be faithful to your religion and still navigate through the complexities of the daily world. So my question here is, first of all, like, in your current job, how do you, because like the book is about tolerance, is about coexistence and these values. So how do you carry this out on a day-to-day basis?
with tremendous difficulty. The minute I open my eyes, I'm challenged. Actually, the book, if you think about it in a certain way, it's about what are the reference points in life that you can rely on in order to do all of the variable things in life. And I find, I was addressing it in the sphere of religion, but I was talking more about how to read life, given your particular point, or your perspective. And I don't think it's a straightforward thing, but I did want people to think about it. I changed my social media feed. So for a while, I stopped receiving anything related to the local economy, the local market, local politics. And all of a sudden, my perception of where I was changed very radically. And that kind of worries me, that we are partly in control of the information that we're receiving, but also we can't fight culture, we can't fight people. And people have conversations around you in your home, at work, that you can't push back on. So where does identity lie? Do we just go with the conversation and accept that that's part of us? Or can we extract ourselves from that and maintain some kind of identity? And so I wrote that book in 2017, and you can see that in 2022 I haven't come to any firm conclusions.
But nor have you changed your mind about any of the advice you gave to your son on that book.
There's one bit of advice I think I've changed. I spoke about trust as being a very, very fundamental human tool to engage with the world. I would not say that now.
Really? Why? You become more cynical about trust?
Yeah, basically, yes. Yeah. Because a betrayal of trust can be so damaging to the person that it kind of negates the whole project in the first place.
Well, yes, but that's precisely the value of it, right? I mean, that if you lived in a world where you were genuinely convinced you couldn't trust anybody, it would be impossible to have meaningful relationships and meaningful contractual engagements.
Yeah, I
so
agree.
there is always an implicit trust, but you have to be mature enough to recognize that some people will turn out to be unworthy of the trust you've placed in them. Does that negate all trust in everybody?
But it isn't simply trust in other people that you meet.
Uh-huh.
It's also trust in sources. It's trust in authority. It's trust in systems.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you just look at the media, it becomes very, very clear that it's extremely difficult to try if you turn on the news in the US. I watch CNN here, and there is a big, big difference between CNN International and then CNN in the US.
Yeah.
And it just feels like continual propaganda. It's somebody beating you over the head with a set of ideas, and you can see that this is an agenda. It isn't even interested in persuading you. It is actually beating the message into you. Then you switch over to Fox News, and you find that it's the exact opposite. So where do you actually find a source of information that is trustworthy, that is even minimally trustworthy?
Well, I think the answer would be to understand the biases and then consult multiple sources. So if you watch the BBC and CNN and Al Jazeera, you've got and maybe even Russia Today and Turkish television, which cover the entire spectrum. You've got all the different views, and you pick and choose what accords with your own prejudices. I mean, in fact, one of the bizarre things about today's world is the surfeit of information. We all have far more information available to us than we have time to give attention to, every one of us. And so there is either implicitly or accidentally a process of selection taking place in the information we allow to permeate our consciousness. I've discovered, for example, that I allow an awful lot of information to come to me from friends, people who are WhatsApping me a link or emailing me a link. And so, in a sense, what happens is you start then reinforcing, if you like, the biases, opinions, and interests of your friends. I have to now make a conscious effort not to open some links that I know may be of interest to a large number of my classmates, but will not be worth the time I'll have to spend digesting it, right? I mean, forwards are really taking up an awful lot of people's time. But imagine there was a time when you would actually have to go out and search for information. Today, none of us has time to do that because information is being flung at us. And I don't know where this is leading, except to say that in that implicit process of selection, you are making your decisions about trust. Which sources you trust, which collection of sources you push to rely upon or to influence your own opinions about things.
But once you've opened the door, so one of my relatives, I asked him if he'd read my book, and he said no, and I won't. I said, well, why not? And he said, because I disagree with your argument, and I don't want it to influence me. So I said, well, if you don't read the book, you won't know the argument, and you won't be able to. But in a way, he had a point, which is if you're continually opening your mind to new information, new arguments, new positions, sometimes taking the same facts and turning them upside down, it becomes very, very difficult to orient yourself in a day. So again, coming back to Russia and the Ukraine, there's this recurring theme that many, many Russian generals have died in the course of battle, and that this is a sign that the Russians have no idea how to run a war. The other argument is, or the counter-argument is that actually Russian generals lead from the front, and they die with their troops. And again, I don't know which one is true, but both arguments have been put out there.
Could both be true? Could both be true?
Well, the first argument says this is incompetence, and the second argument says
This is inspirational
this is leadership.
Yeah.
And we go, yeah. And of course, it makes one think of Barack Obama leading from behind. Yeah? So it becomes, again, you then almost have to sort of make decisions about what you don't want to make a decision about. That this is not actually important enough for me to think about. Actually, we've really strayed from the subject, I think, right?
That's okay. That's okay. Now it's also my time to trust. So I'm going to trust our audience that they also have very good questions for our speakers, because you came up with so many. For sure, I want to give you the chance to ask a question. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Abdullah Bahkali, and I'm from...
I think you should hold the mic a bit closer.
My name is Abdullah Bahkali, and I'm from the Islamic Military Counter-Terrorism Coalition, and I invite Your Excellency to visit our booth in there to learn more about the coalition.
I need the lessons, I agree.
Coalition Against Terrorism, right?
Yes.
Oh, good for
the
you.
Islamic Military Counter-Terrorism Coalition.
Just want to make sure I heard that
Yes.
preposition.
Yes. Probably Joseph Nye was the first to talk about soft powers in the 90s. My question is, can we predict new types of power to achieve politics? Thank you.
New types of power. I mean, the methods to get the same objectives. For example, digital technology. If you actually command a lot of digital technology, you get your message out more widely and more effectively in today's world than if you don't, right? That's an example. You're still following the old rules. You're getting a story out about yourself. You're trying to influence foreign publics. It's simply a new way of so doing. That's about it. But I don't know if Omar would have something more to add to that.
Can I throw out an idea? The power of regulation. And I'm beginning to see this in the Emirates. If you look at blockchain, it's a completely new industry. Crypto and blockchain, completely new industry, looking for a home somewhere, not being able to find a home in well-developed and sort of highly regulated economies. Many of these entrepreneurs are coming to the Emirates, and they are going from emirate to emirate, trying to figure out which emirate is able to regulate locally enough freedom for them to innovate, but also enough regulation so that they are accepted by countries, in the Western world. And it's fascinating to watch it. And each emirate is now looking at the regulation of the other emirate to see, well, what can we change? And if you can actually regulate it properly and you win this regulation game, you've actually created a massive economic opening for the country and for the local population, because these companies will service the world.
Fascinating. There's a new technique.
Go ahead, Ahmed.
So to Dr. Shashi, the question is, okay, we have strayed from the main question, which is what's the future of diplomacy? Nevertheless, in this bright discussion and very scary discussion, we have proven how diplomacy has been a failure since World War I, World War II, and maybe the upcoming World War III. So Dr. Shashi, what's the future of commoners? How can we trust you? Even if such officials has proven to us that diplomacy has failed. And to His Excellency Amr Saif Ghabash, as Assistant Minister for Cultural Affairs, in a country that is filled by 8 million residents that are outside the country, is cultural diplomacy removing our own identity? Thank you.
You go first, Omar, on that one.
Okay, I think you ask me this question every time I speak in public, yeah? I know you. Our identity is subject to global forces. We can hold on to an identity and remain in the desert, or we can modify our identity, evolve, move into new forms of being, and survive in a global economy. Must be very careful. Global economy is is merciless. So we should be merciless with ourselves. So I would say, stop holding on to ideas of identity that don't have a life today. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, actually, I would echo that too. I think, we really ought to have more capacious understandings of identity than narrower ones. On the question of what is the future of, well, there was one word I didn't catch. What is the future of? Commerce. No, trust in governments is different from commerce. But you used a word beginning with, I thought that sound. No? You said,
The failure of diplomacy may cause commoners to miss.
That's what I missed.
Commoners, natural people such as myself.
Commoners. I get it. All right. You're a chess champion. How can you be a commoner? I've heard that. But anyway, okay. So the truth is that that diplomacy has often, throughout the history of diplomacy, had both failures and successes. And one of the inevitable challenges of diplomacy is that you always hear about the failures and you rarely hear about the successes. You'll never know about the wars that were prevented, the crises that were avoided, the snafus that never happened. But every time something goes wrong, it usually ends up being splattered all over the front pages of the world news. So I'd like to assure you that diplomacy is still as useful, as relevant, and about as successful or non-successful as it's always been. But it's just one of those professions where the failures, unfortunately, get attention and the successes, almost by definition, tend to be quiet, tend to be unknown. But on the question of trust in governments on the part of commoners, the truth is that governments have to earn your trust. I think whatever your system is, whatever the traditions are, whether it's a monarchical one, whether it's a democracy, a dictatorship, and variations of all of these themes, ultimately the public will know when they feel they can rely upon their government. Right? And it may not be for everything. For example, I'm sure that in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of anxiety, but people also had faith that the government would ensure basic things worked. There was a joke I remember early in the American occupation when this Iraqi wakes up in the morning, switches on the thing and the light comes on, goes out and finds that the street lights are shining, opens his mailbox and there's a letter in there, picks up his phone and hears a dial tone, and he screams out to his wife, watch out, Saddam is back. Because all these things hadn't been working after the exit of Saddam. So there are always some things you will trust your government on that you know from your own experience of that government. And I think that's always going to be the basic yardstick. I don't think anyone in any society, not even the most advanced, is going to say they trust their government all the time. Certainly America, the world's oldest democracy, there'll be a lot of people who'll tell you that, what was Ronald Reagan's famous line? The two most scariest sentences in the English language, he said, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. He said, those are terrible. So, even there are issues in which you may or may not trust your government. So just accept that that's part of life. Trust the government wherever it's earned your trust, and where you have reasons to doubt it, make sure you don't waste your trust on it.
I've got to say, though, your identity suggests that you trust the government fully. I don't understand where this question came from in the first place. I think I turned the tables on him. Huh? There we go.
We still have a question there, one of the youngest member of our audience. For sure, I want to give you the option to ask your question.
Wow. But he does need a mic.
Increase your voice, okay?
I wanted to say if stone or like other stones can be turned into energy that we can use to power our devices or make holograms.
Could you repeat your question? Sorry. Could you take off your mask?
Take off your mask and maybe repeat it slightly.
I
Slowly.
wanted to say if stone or other kinds of material can be like turned into power or electricity, so we can like use it to make devices or power.
Right. There are new materials that scientists are working on. For example, hydrogen, which you can get out of even simple water, might become a very important source of power in future. And now they're talking about green hydrogen, which will not pollute the world. So maybe by the time you grow up and drive a car, you may be driving a car that's powered by hydrogen and not by petrol. And maybe you'll actually not think of electricity the same way that your daddy's generation thought of it. Okay, so it will vary. There's a lot of things being developed and discussed and invented, and some of us, frankly, are too old to know how that's going to work, but the world has changed a lot. I mean, when you realize that just 100 years ago, hardly anybody had a car, for example, right? The common person went around in horses, and only a few rich people had cars. Today, all the common people have cars, and the rich people have horses, see? So the world has changed. It'll change again while you're growing up. How old are you? 8. Big boy. Good luck. Smart boy.
We still have time for one more question, I think, yeah?
Hello, hi. I would like to go to the point that was raised by Dr. Shashi, telling that, of course, being soft, you will show your weakness. You need to use actually hard power as well, which actually known in politics or international relations as smart power. Well, smart power equal soft power plus hard power.
Right.
But it isn't actually 50-50%. So here is my question to you. How, like, decision makers or, like, let's say, diplomatic decide the portion of each one? When to use this type of power against the other one?
There
Thank
is
you so
no
much.
there is no magic formula. There's certainly no 50-50 formula. It really is what enhances your credibility. Right, so if you're a big, strong government and you are humiliated in some misuse or wrong use or not use of hard power, then your credibility is affected and that undermines your soft power. So they work in tandem. You can, I mean, I can tell you a story. I hope there are no Chinese diplomats here. But it was a good example of how some of these things happen. When the Beijing Olympics was happening in 2008, it was a huge exercise in Chinese soft power, and in some respects a very successful one. The Beijing Olympics opening ceremony was, I believe, the most watched video on YouTube for many, many years. It was really a hugely successful display of Chinese cultural soft power. But in the lead up to the Olympics, all the journalists who were coming to cover started noticing the repression of public opinion, the lack of any facilities to express points of view freely. So the Chinese then said, all right, before the Olympics starts, we will designate, I think it was 8 or 16 points around Beijing, which would be like Hyde Park Corner in London, where anybody can come and say anything they want to, including against the government. But because this is China, they said, anybody who wants to come and stand at any of these points and speak will have to get permission first. So this is all duly reported in the international media. Every single Chinese who applied for permission to speak was promptly arrested. So you can imagine that that particular technique, which was meant to actually bolster their soft power, actually turned out to be an attempt to use what they thought of as smart power to identify all the potential troublemakers and round them up without the trouble of having to look for them, because they would apply and they would be nabbed. Now, this inevitably got reported massively and in a very negative light. So all the countries that thought the Chinese were doing a good thing by allowing people to express themselves suddenly said, my gosh, even this declaration of free expression turned out to be nothing more than a method to identify and arrest the people whom they wanted to catch. And so the result was it actually undermined Chinese soft power. So the issue is, what is the message you want to convey? What makes you look credible? Those are the things that you have to use your power sensibly. But if you use hard power too heavily, you will end up undermining your soft power and vice versa.
Thank you. Ambassador Bash, something to add?
Yeah, tell us another story.
Usually when I want to add, I start interrupting. So, no, I approve of your answer.
There must be a Russian example from your extensive experience there.
Russian example. Gosh. There was a very interesting example in the way in which, again, countries can get away with certain things.
Right.
And I remember that there were protests in Russia, and a number of protesters had been arrested at different locations. About 700 people had been arrested. This was at the same time as the Occupy Wall Street protests in the US, and I think 10,000 people had been arrested in the US. And yet the Russians were criticized massively for preventing freedom of expression. But if you have a good story and you've got a lot of good soft power, you can actually arrest and still stay on the right side of the law. Good story?
Yeah, but it's again your cynicism is quite corrosive and convincing. But I think you're right. That's an interesting way of looking at it. Yeah, I think part of it may well be the perception, especially in those days, that being arrested in America was a token gesture and that nothing would happen to you, whereas being arrested in Russia, you never know what might happen. There was possibly that sense that it was a more something to be more frightened of, to be arrested in Russia or China than be arrested in America. I don't know.
So the Russians passed something called the Foreign Agents Act.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the West criticized this. So if you are a non-governmental organization and you receive funding from an outside country, basically from another government, then you would have to register as a foreign agent.
Right.
Foreign Minister Lavrov showed a copy of the act that had been actually copied from the American legal system. And I think it was in 1933 that the Americans have the same, they passed the same law. And so again, it becomes a bit difficult. I mean, if here we in the Emirates decided to pass the Foreign Agents Act, how would we be treated? And yet these are exactly the same things that happen elsewhere. So I think it's actually soft power that allows you to get away with these things.
Also command of the instruments of mass media.
Soft power.
Because ultimately, who's telling the story? We talk about being the land of the better story. But if the major sources of stories are all under your cultural influence, then the stories that are told about you will assume that you're a good guy and will convey that assumption to your audience. It was interesting, when we talk about, for example, some of the early films and books and novels and so on about the British in India, where the British were the good guys putting down these terrible Indian nationalists who were fighting for their freedom. And as an Indian, I would watch these things. I remember when I was a student in America, watching black and white reruns of 1930s movies, Ganga Din and the lives of the Bengal Lance. And I kept thinking, why do the bad guys keep winning in the end? I mean, but for them, that was part of their story, right? We have to tell our own stories if we want to have a different ending.
We have to actually be aware of the stories that have become a part of our lives. And here, just to give you a small example, I was asked to register for the event today. So last night I went online, Abu Dhabi Book Fair, and it says, are you a UAE resident or are you? And it used a word which is astounding. It says, are you a UAE resident or UAE local? I was like, wait a second. We're still using this term that was brought in by the British over the years, and there was no UAE citizen. It was simply local. I was like, we're not even aware of the words that we use and where they came from, what they mean.
Look at that.
I'm afraid
there you are, the UAE members here are clapping for you.
Yeah. I'm afraid with the British you open the door for Dr. Tahoor to start as well talking about the British. So to avoid this,
I realize it's past time.
Just going to go there for the really last question.
Good evening. Hello,
Good evening.
Dr. Tharoor.
Hi.
My name's Amandeep. I first moved to this region as a BBC journalist. Now I'm based here, and I've had the privilege of interviewing His Excellency Omar Gabash and working with a lot of Emirati and international talent represented in this room. I feel like this discussion has been so eye-opening and insightful. But just one bugbear, a lot of cynicism. We've talked about multilateralism. You said it's most vulnerable since 1945. His Excellency has been cynical about globalization and cynical about trust. I have a lot of hope for this region, working with the talent here. So I'm going to end on a hopeful note, if I
Good.
may.
Yes, you must. We all need
I'm
hope.
a supporter of the book fair and worked very closely with Isabel, and we're hopeful individuals. So may I ask you to please share, first of all, your advice to aspiring diplomats, and secondly, within that point, what gives you hope for the future, and to say thank you so much for a very insightful discussion.
Thank you. Is
Both
that for
of
both
you.
of us, I hope?
Yes,
yeah.
both of you,
I mean,
yes.
let Omar advise the young diplomats, but I will say that my advice to young anybodies is always just to be yourself and be the best version of you that you can be. And then whatever you're doing, you'll do it well and contribute to the world. But as far as what gives me hope, it really is the fact that we identify problems, and especially I think some of us who've had the kind of experiences we've had, it's understandable that we have the ability to spot those problems and we see those trends. But at the same time, we also have the experience to acknowledge that a lot of problems have been resolved over the years, that yesterday's problems are not necessarily today's problems, and today's problems need not be the problems of tomorrow. Change has been a constant. And you know, it's a cliche about how the only thing that keeps occurring is change, and it's true. The world changes all the time. And each year we have got new things to discover, new things coming on stream, and new opportunities. I mean, I know, for example, that when I came out of university in India, and where the next generation of Indians came out of universities, the multiple choices available to them that weren't available to me, in terms of subjects to study, in terms of career opportunities, in terms of places they could go and things they could do. All of that were enough to suggest that, yes, things can go wrong, but there's an awful lot more things that can go right. And that ultimately does give me hope. And I think ultimately looking at young people like that 8-year-old who asked a question is very exciting, because you really feel that as long as they are going to inherit the world, they'll do a better job of it perhaps than our lot has managed to.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor.
Yeah.
Omar Gabash,
Yeah.
last comments?
You know me, and you know that I'm cynical. I don't mean to be cynical in public with a microphone, but it happened tonight, so I apologize to everybody. When the young man asked his question, you noticed that Dr. Sepe didn't allow me to speak. He prevented me from answering. But the thought that occurred to me then was the greatest source of energy is actually optimism. And I thought it isn't always available to everybody. But when you have it, use it as much as you can, because it is limitless, an infinite source of energy.
Inside yourself, inside the child himself. Yeah. Wonderful.
Thank you both.
What's your advice to young diplomats? She asked for that. And since you're in the foreign ministry and I'm not.
Young diplomats, grow up. Come on.
Yeah, go ahead, Isabel.
And thank you all.
So I want to say a huge thank you to these wonderful gentlemen here, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, His Excellency Omar Saif Gabash, and to Dr. Sepe Verheyen for what has been a very interesting, wide-ranging topic. You left out, thank you, you left out Greta Thunberg, because global transformation and the future of soft power, I believe, does not rest with governments. I'm leaving the audience with this, but with individuals who've got that passion to make a change on a global stage. So I would like to thank all of you. There will be a book signing just around the corner. Sorry to throw that in at the last moment and not give you a chance to respond, but also, Dr. Shashi Tharoor will be back at 2 p.m. tomorrow. Can you just tell the audience what they can expect?
I think that's a different it's a conversation about my books and writing, so it's whatever the moderator asks. I have no idea what she's going to be talking about, but there will be a conversation focused on my books and writing, and so anyone interested, this is a book fair after all, you'll hear about. It's centered around my newest book, which actually is almost an anthology of my different kinds of writing over 40 years of published books. So there'll be an awful lot there that people who have read me may find familiar and interesting, and people who haven't read me might want to listen to and go out and pick up a book.
Exactly. It's working now. So I want to say a huge thank you to our esteemed panelists today for actually answering lots of questions and raising more, which is what a good debate at the Abu Dhabi International Book Fair does. Huge thank you to our wonderful panelists. And a huge thank you to the online live streaming team, the translators, the AV team, the volunteers who keep all this show on the road, and to the Arabic Language Centre who organised the Abu Dhabi International Book Fair, and most importantly, for you here in person who make it all worthwhile. Thank you.